Hello there, my fellow myth and fantasy nerds. My name is Tanner, and I'd like to welcome you back to my YouTube channel. So, if you want to know what the weather's been like for the past couple of weeks, the leaves have been slowly changing colors, but the temperature outside still makes it feel like it's the middle of summer. Make of that what you will. Anyway, for this week's video, the second in my spooky season series, I will be retelling a classic story from the maestro of the macabre himself, Edgar Allen Poe. Now, fair warning, this story does get pretty graphic in some places, so viewer discretion and listener discretion is definitely advised here. Now, with that out of the way, as always, make sure you leave a like on this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe down below. Pretty please! It'll help me make new content for you. And without further ado, I bring you The Masque of Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. Lights! Long, long ago, in a faraway land lost to time, a horrendous and fatal plague swept through, annihilating all who were infected by it. The Red Death, it was called. The people of that area called it this because of how the disease presented itself. The first symptom was a sharp pain, which would then progress to severe dizziness, until the profuse bleeding from the pores signaled that the end was upon you. In the end, the bright red stains on one's clothes, body, and face were the signal for the victim's fellows to leave them to their fate, with no help, nor even a hint of pity. Not only that, but once the sharp pain began, the victim had only 30 minutes left to get their affairs in order. It is here where we meet our main character, one Prince Prospero. He was fearless, jolly, and wise, and when the land over which he ruled lost half of its population to the plague, he called 1,000 of his friends to his court, 1,000 lords and ladies, knights and dames, all of whom were healthy and of high spirits, and they all withdrew to one of his secluded abbeys. This was a large and lavish building, and the way it was decorated showed off Prospero's majestic and yet peculiar preferences. A very tall, solidly built wall surrounded the abbey, with iron gates that the prince had welded shut, so that they could keep the pain and misery from the disease out, while keeping the rumpus from the partying in. The prince provided plenty of food and drink, so that his party could last for as long as it could, and they could leave the grief and worries of the outside world behind them. For this party, Prospero catered to every type of entertainment his guests could ever want. There were clowns and poets, music and dancing, gambling and art, and of course, all the food and wine his guests could eat and drink. All this was to ensure that Prospero and his guests were safe inside, while the Red Death raged on outside. It was near the end of the 5th or 6th month of Prospero's seclusion when our story took place, and he and his guests threw a magnificent and unique masquerade party. It was a wondrous scene, one of sheer indulgence. Now, before we move on, I need to share how the 7 rooms in the Abbey suite were built and decorated, in order to provide some context for the rest of the story. Now, normally, the suites in a palace or abbey are built so that they form one long, straight perspective, rather like a large hallway, with folding doors that slide almost entirely flush with the walls on either end. However, Prospero's abbey was built quite differently, in such a way that satisfied the prince's taste for the fantastic and the outlandish. The apartments were all placed erratically, in such a way that you could only fully comprehend one at a time. Every 20 to 30 feet or so, there were abrupt turns to enter another room, and each room was decorated in a different way. Now, the only thing each room had in common was that in the very center of the walls on either side of the entrance hung tall Gothic-style windows, which, when you looked out of them, you could see the rest of the estate, which, because of the way the suites were built, wasn't much of a view. These windows were made of stained glass, and the color of the glass corresponded to the main color of the decorations in each room. Now, the first room, the one furthest to the east, was decorated in varying shades of blue, and the stained glass windows were blue to match. The decorations of the second chamber, and the stained glass in all the windows, was in different shades of purple. The third room was green, the fourth was orange, the fifth was white, and the sixth was decorated in violet, the color between blue and purple on the color wheel. The seventh and final room was the only room where the stained glass did not match the decorations. The decorations of that room were all in black, whereas the stained glass was a deep blood red color. There also were copious amounts of golden decorations scattered this way and that way, and some even hanging from the ceiling. However, none of the rooms had a single lamp or candelabrum to be seen. However, in the corridors, behind each of the windows, there were heavy metal tripods bearing large torches, which provided enough light streaming through the stained glass of the windows, lighting the rooms from the outside rather than the inside. The effects astounded the guests. However, this effect that the torches had when shining through the red window of the black room created a sight so ghoulish on the face of those who walked in that there weren't many guests adventurous enough to so much as walk into that room. In the red room, against the wall opposite the entrance, there stood an enormous ebony clock, whose pendulum would swing back and forth, emitting a low clang every time. Every hour, on the hour, the clock's chimes would sound, which, though loud and musical, was so unique a noise that every musician would pause their music, and every dancer would stop moving, and all the chatter would be silenced until the chime came to an end. This cycle of partying and silence would continue every time the clock chimed on the hour. In spite of the decorations, Prince Prospero's party was an elegant and vivacious one, which called to mind the prince's unique tastes for colors and effects. The decorations of his party were not merely for show, but instead showed his spirited and vivid ideas which shone with a savage beauty, ideas which some would consider quite insane. However, his supporters would tell you that of course he wasn't insane. Why, you only had to see, hear, and feel him, and you would see that he was perfectly sane indeed. Why, even the costumes that the guests wore showed just how bizarre the prince's likings were. They were of a strange nature, dazzling and glamorous, yet also nightmarish and provocative. The costumes were extravagant, with clashing colors, patterns, and decorations, and everything was so grotesque, so outrageous, and quite a few you could call scandalous. And yet each costume showed a sense of beauty in the gruesome. Each guest moved through each of the rooms, taking on the colors of each, echoing the musicians with each step, and only stopping when the large ebony clock struck the hour. And so the banquet went on in this way, up until the 12th hour was struck. Before the last echo of that chime had died down, everyone at the party suddenly noticed a guest in their midst, who up until that point had gone unnoticed by, well, anyone. The knowledge of a stranger amongst their number spread like wildfire, and the whisperings, at first of surprise and disapproval, slowly became whisperings of disgust, alarm, and dread. This was because, in a room full of the grotesque and the ghoulish, this costume was the worst of the worst, and seemed to cross some imaginary line that no one else dared to cross. The guest was abnormally tall and thin, and their costume was that of Death himself. The mask took the appearance of someone long dead, in the throes of rigor mortis, and was so realistic, even the closest examination would have trouble believing it was a mask at all. However, everything from the robes to the mask was bright blood red in color, and everyone realized with horror that the costume was a representation of the Red Death itself. When Prospero saw this figure, moving slowly and quietly amongst the crowd, as if Death himself was haunting the guests, at first he shivered with fear, but soon that fear gave way to anger and indignation. "How dare you?" he said to the figure. "How dare you insult our misery? Unmask them, so we may see who we should hang from the towers at sunrise." Now when Prospero said these words, he was in the blue room. But as he was a powerful man, and the music had stopped when he waved his hand, the sound of his shouts carried through the rest of the 7 rooms. At first, people started towards the trespasser, but soon fear gripped the other guests, and they found no one could work up the courage to grab them. And so the figure slowly approached Prospero. "Why are you all standing there?" the prince said again. "Capture them, I say!" But the other guests were frozen in fear. The intruder passed within 3 feet of the prince, and as the other guests moved from the middle of the room to the walls, they kept walking, that somber pace, as though leading a funeral procession. The intruder passed from the blue room to the purple room, then through the green room, then the orange, then the white, then the violet. Then Prince Prospero, angry and ashamed at himself for his lapse in courage, ran through each of the chambers with a dagger held aloft, while every other guest stood aside in terror. Prospero was less than 3 feet away from the other figure until, in the middle of the red room, the intruder finally turned around and faced the attacker. Prospero let out a sudden shriek and instantly dropped to the floor, dead as a doornail, the dagger clattering from his hand. As if the paralysis suddenly broke on them, each of the guests ran into the red room and grabbed the intruder. Then, in shock and horror, they all discovered that underneath the costume and the mask, there was nothing but empty space. At that point, the Red Death revealed himself to each of the guests, and one by one they dropped dead on the spot, their faces shining with blood. And as the last of the guests dropped like a stone, the clock stopped chiming, and the flames and the torches went out. Finally, darkness and decay took over, as the Red Death claimed its final victims. Wow, again, I say, it's real bright in here. Anyway, and there we have it. That was The Masque of Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. If you liked this video and you want more, please consider leaving a like and subscribing down below so you don't miss any new content from me. Also, if you have any other ideas you want to see in future videos, please leave your thoughts in the comments down below. Who knows? It might just happen. Alright, well, that's all the time I have for this video, so I'll see you all next week with some more spooky season content. See you guys then.